Welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're all about OS2 Presentation Manager. We're going to learn about coding with it, its quirks, its benefits, the whole 9 yards. And get this, we've got sources from way back when, like a tech time capsule. Think of us as your guides through this vintage tech landscape. Ready for a trip back to the golden age of OS2? Let's fire up that Presentation Manager and see how it works.
It's amazing how OS2 Presentation Manager was actually a rival to those early versions of Windows. We're talking late 80s, early 90s, when graphical user interfaces were just starting to get popular.
Okay, for those of us who weren't around then or barely remember floppy disks, what exactly was OS2 Presentation Manager? Can you set the scene for us?
Picture a time before Windows took over every desktop. OS2, developed by IBM and Microsoft, was a pretty powerful alternative, and Presentation Manager, or PM, that was its graphical user interface, the part you actually interacted with, and it was a lot more than just clicking icons. PM took a much more sophisticated approach to building applications, especially for its time.
Sophisticated, you say. Now intrigued, what made it so different from, say, Windows 3.1?
Well, PM was built on the concept of objects. Think of it like Legos, windows, menus, dialog boxes. They were all treated as objects with their own properties and behaviors. And that meant developers could create modular code, reusable code, making development a lot faster.
It's clever. It's like creating a blueprint for a window you could use over and over.
Yeah,
But how did these objects talk to each other? It wasn't like they were sending smoke signals, right?
right. That's where the messaging system comes in a really cool concept. Imagine every object has a little inbox where it gets messages. These messages could be anything from draw yourself on the screen to, hey, the user clicked you, what should we do?
So it's like a constant stream of messages between objects telling them how to act and react.
Exactly. Some messages are handled right away, like a real-time chat. Others are posted and handled later, which allows for more complex interactions. And all this happened in the background, making everything feel smooth and responsive for the user.
Okay, I'm seeing how smart this design was.
hmm
But a graphical interface isn't just about what it does, it's also about how it looks, right?
Ah, for that, we have the Graphics Programming Interface, or GPI, the artistic side of PM. It gave developers the power to draw lines, shapes, text, you name it, even handle different fonts. GPI even had something called coordinate transformations.
Coordinate transformations. Sounds like geometry class. What did that let developers do?
It was like image editing. You could rotate, scale, even skew the visual elements. So they were creating some pretty advanced visual effects, especially back then, because PM had to look good and function well, and GPI made that happen.
So we have objects sending messages and GPI making everything visually appealing. What was it actually like to code for this thing? Were we talking punch cards and mainframes?
No, no punch cards, luckily. Back then, you'd probably use something called Visual Age for C++, plus a pretty sophisticated tool for its time.
So more like coding in Notepad than dragging and dropping widgets.
You got it. But PM did offer some handy features. It came with a library of ready-made controls, things like buttons, sliders, list boxes, all that good stuff. So developers didn't have to start from scratch every single time.
Smart thinking. Even back then, they knew developers needed a helping hand. Okay, I'm curious, what did actual PM code look like? Could you show us a Hello World program just as an example?
Absolutely. The basic structure would involve interacting with the messaging system we talked about. First, you'd initialize PM, then create a message queue for your application, like its personal message inbox, and then register a window class.
A window class, is that like a template for your window?
Exactly. It defines all the basic features of the window. Then you create the actual window object based on that class.
And that's where the Hello World magic happens.
Right. Well, not magic exactly, but it's the message loop. This loop is the core of any PM application. It's constantly checking for new messages and sending them to the correct window procedure.
Hold on, window procedure, what was that again?
Basically, it's a function that decides how a window object reacts to different messages. So when the message loop sees paint yourself, it calls the window procedure. And that procedure has the code to draw the window, including your hello world text.
I see, so the message loop is like a super efficient mail carrier, always delivering messages, and the window procedure is the recipient taking action based on those messages.
Perfect analogy. And once you're done, you'd clean up by destroying the window, closing that message queue, and you're done using PM.
Wow, even a simple Hello World program in PM shows us how its architecture works. It's fascinating how all these parts fit together.
It is. And that object-oriented approach with all those messages going back and forth, that was what made PM so powerful and flexible. One thing that really stands out about Presentation Manager is how much it focused on multitasking. This was a big deal for OS2, especially compared to those early Windows versions. Back then, one program crashing could take down the whole system.
Yeah, I've heard those stories about Windows 95. So how did OS2 and PM manage to avoid those multitasking meltdowns?
Well, OS2 was designed with something called protected mode. It's a bit technical, but basically it created separate memory spaces for each program. So even if one program went crazy, it couldn't mess up the memory used by other programs or the operating system itself.
Ah, so it's like each program had its own little sandbox to play in, keeping everything safe from each other.
Exactly. And PM was built to take full advantage of protected mode, so applications could run at the same time without interfering with each other. It was a big step towards those stable multitasking systems we use today.
So PM applications were well behaved in this multitasking world. But what about accessing resources like memory or files? Did they ever have to share?
Of course. And that's where OS2 had some really interesting tricks up its sleeve. One important concept was semaphores. Think of it like a one-lane bridge. Only one car can cross at a time, right?
Okay, I get the picture. So how do semaphores work in software?
Imagine multiple programs all trying to access the same file or piece of memory at the same time. That could lead to data corruption or crashes if they're not careful. Semaphores are like a traffic light controlling access to those shared resources.
So before a program can access a shared resource, it has to check the semaphore and wait its turn.
Exactly. OS2 had different types of semaphores, some faster, some slower, depending on what you needed. Developers had to choose the right one for the job, but it gave them a lot of control over how their applications handled shared resources.
That makes sense. Sounds like OS2 really thought about how to make multitasking smooth and reliable. Let's switch gears a bit and talk about visuals. We touched on GPI, PM's graphics engine, but how did it deal with fonts? Were there only a few basic ones to choose from?
Not at all. PM actually had really advanced font handling for its time. It supported vector fonts, which meant they could be scaled to any size without getting pixelated.
Vector fonts, those are the ones made up of mathematical curves, not pixels, right? So no more jagged edges when you make the font bigger.
You got it. That was a big deal back then. It meant you could have much sharper and more professional-looking text, especially on high-resolution displays.
I bet that was important for things like desktop publishing, which was just starting to become popular.
Definitely. PM was ahead of the game when it came to font technology.
Okay, we've talked about objects, messages, multitasking, even fonts. What else made OS2 Presentation Manager so innovative?
One of the key features of PM was its virtual memory system. This was a game changer. It let programs use more memory than the computer physically had.
Wait, how is that even possible? Sounds like some kind of digital magic.
It's clever engineering, that's for sure.
Right.
The operating system would swap chunks of memory between RAM and the hard drive as needed.
So data that wasn't being used as much would be stored on the hard drive, freeing up RAM for more active processes.
Precisely. This meant developers could create more powerful applications. They weren't limited by how much RAM the computer had. It paved the way for the memory-hungry applications we use today.
I can see how revolutionary that was. Programs weren't limited by physical RAM anymore, opening up all sorts of new possibilities for developers. What an amazing innovation.
It was, and OS2 was one of the first operating systems to really embrace virtual memory and make it practical for everyday use.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, from the object-oriented design of PM to multitasking, fonts, and even virtual memory. What other hidden gems are waiting to be discovered? We've been talking about all these amazing technical features of OS2 Presentation Manager, but I'm thinking about the bigger picture. How did all of this fit into the evolution of operating systems? Was PM kind of a lone wolf, or were there other players in this graphical revolution?
Oh, it was definitely a time of fierce competition and innovation. You have to remember back then, personal computers were still relatively new. DOS with its command line interface was king, but it was starting to show its age.
So OS2, with its fancy presentation manager, was trying to take over.
In a way, yeah. But it wasn't the only one trying to be the top dog. Microsoft, of course, was pushing Windows. And there were others, too, like Digital Research's GM. It was a wild time for graphical interfaces, each one with its own pros and cons.
It sounds like it would have been exciting to be a developer then, seeing all these new ideas pop up. But what set OS2 and Presentation Manager apart?
Well, we've talked about some of the key advantages, that object-oriented approach, the strong multitasking, the really good graphics capabilities. But OS2 also had a reputation for being stable and reliable, which was a big deal back then.
So it wasn't just about looking good. OS2 had some serious power under the hood. Did that reliability come from the protected mode we talked about earlier?
Exactly. You know how early Windows users were always getting those dreaded blue screens of death? OS2 was designed to prevent those huge system crashes. Its protected mode architecture kept programs separate from each other and from the core system, so the risk of a system-wide crash was much lower.
So it was like bringing mainframe stability to the world of personal computers. That must have been a major selling point for businesses.
Absolutely. And don't forget about those advanced memory management and virtual memory features OS2 introduced. They were game changers, allowing developers to build much more complex and demanding applications.
It really sounds like OS2 and Presentation Manager were pushing the limits of what personal computers could do. But if it was so innovative, why didn't it become the main operating system everyone used?
Well, that's a complicated story. A lot of factors were at play. Marketing and timing were definitely important. Microsoft was really aggressive in promoting Windows, and they had the advantage of bundling it with their popular MS-DOS operating system.
So being in the right place at the right time and some smart business decisions gave Windows a big boost.
Yeah, that's part of it. But there were also some technical things to consider. OS2 might have been more advanced in some ways, but Windows was probably easier to develop for, and it quickly got a larger ecosystem of applications and hardware support.
It's a good reminder that sometimes, even when something is technically brilliant, it's not enough to guarantee success. The market and the surrounding ecosystem can be just as important.
Absolutely. And in the end, the market chose Windows. But that doesn't mean OS2 and Presentation Manager didn't have an impact. A lot of the concepts they introduced, like preemptive multitasking, protected memory, and virtual memory, are standard in today's operating systems.
It's amazing to see how those ideas, which were once cutting edge, are now the foundation of our digital world.
It really is, and it shows that even technologies that don't become hugely popular can still leave behind a legacy of innovation.
Well, I think we've successfully completed our deep dive into OS2 Presentation Manager. We've explored its history, its technical details, and how it fit into the evolution of operating systems. It's been a fascinating trip back in time.
It has, and who knows, maybe this will inspire some of our listeners to dig deeper into this often forgotten part of computing history.
Maybe we'll even see a revival of OS2 development. Stranger things have happened in tech. But for now, it's time to say goodbye to the Presentation Manager and come back to the present.
Until next time, when we'll embark on another deep dive into the amazing world of technology.
Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those curious minds active.